Are Clayton and Derek in the same room?
We are.
We are.
All right, we have quorum. All right, let me share my screen and I'll just walk through some of the details here. So first off, there was an email sent about the contributor summit for KubeCon EU soliciting feedback from the steering committee with regards to what we wanted to do, if there's any modifications or suggestions, questions, comments, complaints, concerns that we should feedback. I did have some initial questions about the contributor summit for KubeCon EU outlines basically new contributors, but we already have a large contributor pool. I don't know if folks have any quick hot takes or thoughts on this, or do folks want time to review?
I'm sorry, are you suggesting that we don't focus on them, or that we focus on like senior contributors as a separate track?
There's a missing aspect that we traditionally had with the contributor summit, where we had experienced contributors or SIG sessions or something akin to that. This is kind of missing from this document. They do have this optional portion here where they say it's an optional SIG session for face-to-face meetings. I'd almost like just nix the optional piece and call it good enough, in my opinion, but I don't know if other folks have thoughts there.
I had maybe somewhat similar thoughts or what I was trying to voice in another section where I said there's a lot of sub-projects, and so anything we can do to facilitate like networking between people in different parts of the project, to maybe they're contributors in one area but should be bridged to others. And so we could either do it as, it sounds like there's already a section, like a planned session for face-to-face meetings, and then maybe we could facilitate like hallway track a little better as well by saying like, hey, if you're interested in this topic, like this part of the hallway is a good place to head or something like that.
That seems reasonable to me. Any other questions, comments, complaints, concerns?
Do we have a good idea about how many contributors from each SIG are going to Barcelona? Paris is commenting in the chat that we need contributors in time zones outside the US. That also implies we don't have enough or that many in some SIGs contributors outside the US. So I wonder if that should affect our goals and expectations for the summit in terms of, you know, how much work will get done, or, you know, communication amongst existing contributors versus just focusing on ramping up some new serious contributors in European time zones.
Paris?
So the last time we did a summit for current contributors in Europe, it was mostly Americans. And I thought that, I mean, specifically me, I can say I fit. The original idea here was to bump this up to just new contributors so that we can grow this base of people, so that when we have summits at other locations, that it's a diverse group of full of people that we're working with, and it's not just Americans in this city. And then also, I mean, we do have a lot of legitimate needs for other time zone contributors, especially in contributor experience, for instance. So I just feel like this is more growing our bases, growing our contributor bases in other areas, and giving the project more diversity and fresher perspectives. And we'll also be training them in the narrative that we see fit. So we feel like the quality will also be impacted in a positive way. I'm sorry for the background noise, everyone. I'm so sorry. But yes, the face-to-faces are intended to be optional, but we already have plenty of SIGs that have said that they were interested in this. So I feel like there's definitely going to be the current contributor content there through that avenue. But then we're also going to do a social the day before, which will have current contributors as well. in like a 3 to 5 hour long social setting. So that's sort of the halting track.
Okay. As long as there's an easy means for the SIGs to be able to request a face-to-face session or to get that ramped up in a reasonable time frame, I think that seems like a reasonable way to meet all the criteria that, all the requests that people have had. One, we focus a lot on the community and trying to grow the community, but we still have the exit path for existing contributors to be able to talk about roadmaps and other detailed discussions.
Tim,
Yes.
do you think the deep dive sessions don't adequately serve that purpose?
Deep dive sessions don't actually facilitate conversation, right? They're more of like, they're a point for us to discuss high level roadmaps and here are the intricate details of a project or sub-project, but they don't actually facilitate like broader discussion amongst contributors for us to like needle on details of what it means to execute on say, some roadmap item.
Like in an unconference?
Yeah, kind of unconferencey, talking about high level things and execution items and broad sweeping things. Some things that come up in the past are like sub-projects that even percolated out of a face-to-face conversation from a KubeCon.
Yeah, I like that idea just because the topics will depend on who's there, right? Right that time, right?
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I found even things like the happy hour to be extremely constructive, where there's just food and drinks and people can set their own agenda.
Right,
Okay.
but then you don't know what people are talking about, right, Phil? So you might miss on a conversation because you're on another corner of the room.
Yeah, so we need to do a better job of facilitating that.
So perhaps if folks can take a look at the document and want to add some details there, they're actively soliciting feedback and I already went through and walked through and gave some initial feedback, and also talk with Jonas as well to see if what we can do on some of the items that I mentioned before. Should we move on?
Yes.
Silence is all right.
So one sec. So who's going to be there? I don't know if I'll be able to be there from the steering committee.
I will be there.
I want to be there too.
Okay. So at least a couple of us are going to be there. Good.
Yeah, I intend to be there.
All right. So next up, before I go into the actual backlog, I did a bunch of triage across the whole backlog because it looked woefully out of date. I used the standard pattern that we use in SIG cluster lifecycle for triaging the backlog, and I used a little bit of my own jurisprudence on understanding which ones I thought were critical and which ones were important. And I was going to update the project board maybe after we had a conversation. But the first thing I wanted to do was actually to create like a target milestone for something. I just put April 2019 as an arbitrary milestone. The reason I did this was because a lot of times in their steering conversations, we talk about things, but I wanted to actually get like traction of execution to burn down our backlog. Is there a time frame or do folks have thoughts about this?
We started this way, where we had like a 3-month milestone we were giving ourselves. I still think it's a good idea.
Are there any opinions about like final date? Should I just move this to like May?
It might be good to do May if we're going to start, or maybe like early May, or something aligned with a meeting, our first meeting in May or something. I think it's a good idea, Tim. I think we got into the devolution stuff where we were iterating more in the SIGs, and now we've built up more of a backlog here. So having a concrete milestone is helpful.
Yeah, May is the summit, the KubeCon in Europe, right? So we can pick that date.
Or maybe before that. Not everyone's going to be there, so maybe the steering committee meeting before that. Right?
I said May 8th here. I'm not quite certain if that's a meeting day or not.
Sounds good.
All right, to walk through the current milestone, there's a bunch of things that I've marked as like help wanted all over the place because not all of them require us to be involved in. They can be, delegated out. There's a couple of items I did want to address first, kind of in a priority order because they've been sitting for a long time. And I think we should probably figure out ways to close them out. Is it okay with folks if we kind of walk through in sort of the order that I kind of laid out here?
Sure.
All right, so the first one that's been sitting around for a long time was the cleanup and audit of working groups. There's been a bunch of, like a long time ago, the original spreadsheet that we created just seems to have stalled, right? And there were PRs to the main repository to update these. Do folks know if this is still a thing that we still need to address? Are there still legacy working groups that should be pruned or updated or collapsed?
We certainly have gone through and done the first 2 passes. I haven't seen any updates in the last 2 weeks, but before that, we did a good job of getting the list down for sure.
Paris mentioned it.
The only item, Tim, on this one
I
I would
have,
go through.
like, I can, so I know that contributor experience, like George from Contribex is working on this, and he has pruned most of the inactive working groups, and the last one that's being discussed right now is the machine learning working group and whether it should be converted to a user group. There's an open issue for that on the community repo. And there is also an umbrella issue tracking this in the community repo, so maybe this can be closed out here as well.
Yeah, we can maybe just replace this with one about the machine learning working group or something if we need to, or just assume it will happen.
I think it's fine from a steering perspective for us to close it out because Contribex is already working on it. They've been given responsibility, and they're working through the details.
Sounds good.
So Phil, I see Daniel right behind you. Is the apply working group still active? Or is that done?
Apply just went to alpha. There is still work to do to go to beta and then GA. We've reduced the frequency of meetings to every other week. The working group is still active. Of course, it doesn't own code, it's submitting code to regular,
Yeah, but it's still active and useful. That's good. Okay, that's all I was wondering. Yeah, and obviously the feature lifecycle is different from the working group lifecycle, but if you guys are finding it useful, then that's awesome.
Yeah, I believe once it goes to GA, then there won't be anything for that group to do.
So 6 months-ish, 9 months.
It's been quiet, so I get suspicious.
Nothing's on fire. This working group isn't doing anything.
What's going wrong?
Yeah.
No, so the reason it's a working group is because it's joint between SIG CLI and SIG API machinery. Yeah.
The next one I had up as critical or urgent to address in sort of a priority fashion was the charter meta issue. This is like the long-standing issue we've had since forevers. I wondered whether or not it made sense to keep this open because we have a bunch of the charters already merged. And I wondered whether or not we should just open per issue or issues for the individual charters that we think need to be refined. And I can happily go through and take a look at what currently exists and what's missing.
I like that idea.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good.
In fact, I think most of the remaining issues are blocked by things that have tracking issues already, like moving some of the cloud provider SIGs under SIG Cloud Provider.
Yeah, and I'd even talked with Andrew Sai Kim on this, and I helped him with his charter a little bit on the language and vernacular. And I also talked with Nishi's about her proposal to collapse things, and things are moving along smoothly there. So I think they're making good progress. Next up, there was the steering committee charter update. We were still looking for a couple of minor final approvals from folks.
So according to the process we have documented, this is just going to get merged next week if no one does anything. I think there's like a three-week lazy consensus sort of thing built in. But if 3 people want to LGTM it, then we can just merge it.
Maybe we'll feel guilty just by being on this call and go right now.
You can look and see if there's a checkbox next to your name.
Yeah. Next up was I'm going to go back to the other priority order, which actually it's correct now. That should fall in line with the current document. The document working groups, how they are formed or disbanded. I believe I put a comment in here trying to see what else needed to be done, or I actually went to the main issue to see what else needed to be done.
So here, like in the community repo, we already have like a SIG working group lifecycle document. I think Paris did some refactoring around that. So the document how to form and disband part is done. The only part that's remaining here is a mapping from working groups to SIGs. There is an open issue on the community repo. I think it's like the last issue that's mentioned here. And a community member already created a nice table with that mapping, and we want him to PR it in because he did all the hard work. He's on vacation, so we'll probably get that in after he's back.
Given the current state, does it make sense to keep this open, or should we close this issue now? Because it looks like you're pending on one community issue, which is already in flight.
I think it can be closed, and we can track it in the community repo.
Yeah, sounds good.
This one was put on by you, Phil, on the order in the document. Or is it just because of the order backlog that was previously in the project?
I copied it straight out of the projects thing. If you want to do something different, I was going off the order in the projects. I didn't realize there was a milestone.
Yeah, well, I just made it. So there was a couple of things that I think also fall into the category of we just need some finalization on the details. Formalized subprojects. I did give some feedback to Nikita. I think you're on the call right now, and I think Brian also gave some feedback too as well.
I've just added a couple of questions around automation about that, but I think like if we can dock something around subprojects, we can just follow up on the automation later.
Okay. I think this one is kind of important because as we're starting to collapse SIGs into larger umbrella SIGs that have many sub-projects underneath them, I do think this is important for us to keep a hold of just so that we have some level of understanding of where it's at. So if people ask us questions. So perhaps,
this is around the life cycle, like we've done for working groups and SIGs. It's around the life cycle of these things rather than which ones exist and that sort of thing, right?
part of its life cycle and part of its automation.
And just connecting the dots. So Nikita, I'll answer the latest questions and try to move it forward. I don't know how much time we want to spend on it now, but the high level idea is we are organizing the people of the project in terms of SIGs and we were organizing code in terms of repos and subdirectories and owners files, and there was no direct linkage between the two, and subprojects are the linkage. So we still have some dots left to connect to help clarify that and make it easier to manage. So that's the high-level summary.
Right.
Okay.
There was one other thing that we were talking about here, if you remember, Nikita, Brian. Do we need like technical leads in the subproject itself? We currently just have a subproject owner.
Yeah, so one issue is, should we change the terminology, which has been used but somewhat inconsistently for years? And I'm fine with that if we come up with a better term. Another is, do we need to define more roles for subprojects? And in some cases, the answer may be yes. Depends on how large and how active the subprojects are. For the specific proposed duties, I think of that as more of project management. Like a lot of the subprojects don't have their own meetings. They just report back in the SIG meetings. So I think in general, it would be helpful to take some of the learnings from SIG cluster lifecycle and some of the other SIGs with many subprojects like SIG networking and try to distill some best practices. And one of these best practices might be certain types of roles that the subproject should have and how they should report back to the SIG as a whole, how they should groom issues. Maybe we need labeling for each subproject and so on.
I think from there's process and policy, which can be very flexible, but then there's like table stakes of organization and discovery. I think the one thing that I held out on was they need a point of contact of who can be the person to be the liaison for entry into a subproject. Because right now the owner's file reference that exists inside the current community repo, I don't think is sufficient, because it's just a bunch of GitHub handles, and not all of them, the way the owner's files are structured, especially in subprojects, is a little awkward because the main SIG leads are typically in there, but they're not necessarily always the active contributors for that subproject. So a point of contact is usually useful.
Yeah, that would be good.
So Brian, you said changing terminology. What terminology were you thinking?
Well, the
term tech lead, or?
Yeah, and right now they're called owners, and that has been confused because with the owners file mechanism itself. So just to some other term, tech lead is what came to mind because the term lead was proposed, but for a different set of responsibilities. But just I would normally think of.
Yeah, so minimal more metadata that's clear around these things does seem to make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, just for a concrete example, if I go to community, and the reason why it matters to us because people always ask questions in SIG cluster lifecycle, particularly about cluster API subproject, and it just points to the owner's file, right? And people need to know that there's a Slack channel for this, and that there is there are points of contact that we can put inside of here.
Yeah. I mean, that cluster API, I believe, also has a meeting, right? So there are mailing lists, meetings, Slack channels, points of contact. Those would all be useful to put here. Yeah.
Yeah. Tim, like, is a mailing list like a sufficient point of contact? It's not a individual person, but it's a way of getting in touch, and you just want that information here. Is that kind of what you're suggesting?
Yeah, just some way to bootstrap people. So I think the two things that are kind of commonplace across, the Kubernetes organization is Slack channels and mailing lists, right? So if they had those 2 points of contact, I think that probably would be sufficient.
Do we want to create an issue to reach out to SIGs and kind of ask for this? Or is this just an informative thing that this would be a useful thing for people to do?
I think as long as the metadata exists for us to populate inside of the community repo, inside the sigs.yaml, I don't know whether or not it's a requirement. As Brian mentioned, not all subprojects meet all the time or may not have their own Slack channel. So I don't know if it's a requirement whether or not to have that. But so long as we have the ability to add that field or set of fields to the sigs.yaml file, I think that is sufficient.
Plus, we are also saying that they can have their own labels and things like that too, right? Just like SIGs.
I think so. In the past, we used area labels for these things, like kubeproxy has an area label, and now that's a subproject.
Right. So do we need like a different bot command instead of /sig? We will say something else.
Well, we have /area also, right? So yeah, I would say /subproject for assigning the subproject. And maybe that doesn't get rid of all the area labels, but probably a number of them could be converted to subprojects.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. Area sounds good to me.
Nikita, does this give you enough information?
Yep, I will also add a comment on the issue about like next steps or something.
Okay, I added you as current
Yeah, that's
assignee.
cool. Yeah.
Thank you so much too, by the way, for all the work that you've been doing in the community repo. It's been super helpful.
No problem.
Yeah, absolutely, +1 to that.
Next up was, it's also in the similar vein, was document process for user group formation. I do know that there was a bunch of things done here.
So support for user groups has been added to 6.yaml, so you can actually create a user group right now. There is a PR open to add big data as a user group, but there is no governance document for it. So this issue is mainly to create processes and governance document for user groups.
I think this is pretty important. Is there anyone on the steering committee who's interested in helping to draft a document with regards to the governance model for user groups?
I've done a lot of that work. If I can help draft it, certainly.
There's an interesting overlap here, and I'd wonder, I know Paris is on the line, like comparing this to like meetups and stuff like that, because I know there has been some talk of getting arms around the various in-person meetups. And so there might be some sort of joining of the streams here where maybe meetups end up being like geographic based user groups. So we charter them that way for being able to use the name and everything.
So maybe there are other kinds of meetups you're thinking about, Joe, but meetups, as you pointed out, tend to be geographically centered as opposed to topical. So a lot of the demand for user groups are on specific types of workloads or specific use cases, and not so much geographically centered.
What I'm suggesting here is that we expand the idea of user group to include geographic-based meetups in addition to virtual topic-based user groups, because from a governance, code of conduct, use of the logo, all that stuff, there's really a lot in common.
I have an idea. Maybe you could document it in the issue number 92.
All right, I'll put that in the issue and we can discuss it there.
So have you looked at what the CNCF does with the meetups, Joe?
I haven't been paying attention. I know that there's been efforts around that, but I haven't been tracking that. But it seems like there's a ton of overlap here, that's all.
Okay, yeah, I mean, whoever pokes at that should probably ask Ihor what is being done in that area and what the current status is. I think there are various kinds of support, like materials they can use to present about different CNCF projects. And I think the CNCF code of conduct, the event code of conduct does apply. Yeah.
For those who are following along, the way I roll with grooming is if you speak up, you get assigned. that means you're passionate about the idea, and usually that's the way I roll. Next up are elections meta issue. The reason I added this to important soon, and the reason I prioritize some of these things was because A, we've talked about it, or B, it's been stale, or C, we took too long last time in the past, and this is C. So I was wondering whether or not there we wanted to at least initially assign a group of folks to start thinking about elections early, well ahead of the actual election process, so that way we can address some of the common concerns from Contribex that happened in the 2018 election. Or should we just leave it as help wanted and discuss next time?
Hey, Paris, are you able to talk?
Okay. Yeah, I just have severe background noise. I'm sorry.
Okay, so are all of the issues in the past election cataloged in this issue, or
Yeah.
are there additional things? They are.
Everything's cataloged here.
Okay.
I mean, the other, I can't see right now, I'm not going to the issue, but if it's not there, like what it means to be an active contributor, to be eligible to vote, I think was another issue on there.
Okay. Members of standing.
Correct. I think the years prior, it's a year, and I think that was mentioned.
Are there volunteers who want to at least start to initially have the discussions around this? Because last time I think we waited too long. And I know that I got feedback from Contribex about some of the issues that they had run into along the way, and some feedback that they had gotten. So I thought about at least starting the conversation early and maybe get some assignees. And then I don't expect that obviously to be done in this milestone, but at least to have the initial people who want to work on this assigned.
I'll volunteer for that.
I will boot it out of this milestone now that has somebody who's working on it. All right, so we talked about subprojects, we talked about user groups. There are a couple other things that we talked about recently that might be worthwhile to discuss as a group, seeing how it's germane to other conversations that are ongoing and other documents that have seen flowing through the CNCF. Right now, the CNCF charter is kind of like lacking with regards to other responsibilities that we see applying across other projects. And I do know that people are updating it. And there's a bunch of documentation that's in flight here. But there's been an open issue we've had on our backlog for a while with regards to funding and budgeting. And it's a very generic statement, which is like fund requested and budgeting process needs to be formalized and documented. I don't know if there's anyone who's been involved in those conversations at the CNCF level that might also be interested in documenting how we as a organization underneath the CNCF sort of do formalized requests for funding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think we discussed this at a previous steering meeting also with the idea that, you know, if it's under a certain dollar amount, we'll just let people directly file an issue with the service desk, and otherwise we'd ask them to bring it to the steering committee, and we'd either approve it or we'd file the service desk issue. So I think that's the main thing. What this came out of originally was a lot of people involved in the project were going directly to people like Dan in the CNCF and asking for money, and there's no tracking where we could even tell what funding was being requested. And since they've sort of consolidated on the service desk, that is less of an issue, but it is still an issue. So Paris has been, I think, recently filed a request for, I don't know, something, I'm sure, and which is probably fine, you know, because, for example, I get CC'd, and I assume other steering members do also, when anything related to Kubernetes gets filed, right? So that at least creates a notification mechanism and a paper trail where we can tell what's going on. And, you know, certainly for the people who would normally do that, if it's a big ticket item like tens of thousands of dollars or something, then people would normally ask us. So I think this is more or less a solved problem, except it's not really officially documented.
Is there anything related to higher order capabilities, such as like automation and testing, things like the Slack problem, right? We have no funding, or we have no funding to devote towards development efforts to do bot creation and automation. People are doing it of their own volition right now. And the reason why I put this on the near term to talk about was because that was one of those issues where we don't actually have an owner, right? We've kind of tasked Contribex with doing this work, but they don't actually have the resources and capabilities to do all of the work.
So Michelle and Brandon gave a great presentation to the GB and TOC on Monday with some common needs of projects. And honestly, it was like deja vu with some of the things that Envoy project is going through, that Kubernetes went through a couple of years ago. So the visibility of this is being raised with the GB and is a priority area of the TOC, and both Michelle and Brandon are very active on that. So I suggest that they kind of be the point people on that effort.
I mean, just to put a finer point on that, I think, you know, we have essentially a whole new TOC of the CNCF, and there's a renewed focus in figuring out what are the services and the support materially that the CNCF can offer projects, and how can we up level that. And so, you know, it's up to us to figure out what we're looking for and what we want, and to sort of tee it up so that it's actionable.
Yeah, in the previous TOC, most of the TOC members were not directly involved with foundation projects, and now that has totally changed. Now that we have new people on board, and Matt Klein is the first contributor from outside Kubernetes who's on the TOC, so he brings a little bit of a separate perspective. I mean, even both contributor or maintainer representatives to the GB, Michelle and Brandon, are both heavily involved in Kubernetes. So anyway, so
what I can do is I will articulate some of the things that we talked about in this issue, and then assign and talk with Brandon and Michelle for a follow-up. And potentially we can close this as an external thing being done by the CNCF. But we still need to have some documentation, at least on our side, to be able to outline what is the process.
Agreed.
Okay.
Yeah, and Paris has exercised the process many times. So Paris or Brandon, who I think is involved with things like the bug bounty and such, would be good candidates for people to document it.
Okay, I will follow up then on that item. There were a couple of items here that I marked as help wanted because no one had stood up for them. I put them as important soon, only because I think some of them have just been languishing for a long time. or there's actually legit problems. Like this has been a legit problem for quite some time, and it was also a recent topic in SIG-Arch with regards to like having enough people working in a content area that needs help, right? So this item has been open for a while. It says document resources that the community has and make sure that they have a home, release Twitter. But also, I think this was also about documenting areas that need assistance and how to. When I read it, I read it as we also need areas that, how do we funnel execution priority for the project and resources towards areas that require resources.
I think we have a mechanism now. We're just not exercising it effectively yet, which is the role board for the project.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to maybe just do some campaigning. Like I'm even guilty of that in SIG architecture. And we need to actually go identify the work that needs to get done and define a role around it, and then actually try to solicit help on the role board and then mentor someone into a position where they can execute on that.
Yeah, I think I read into this a couple different ways. It was like a Rorschach card for me. So the this particular item I just booted out, and this could probably be handled by someone from Contribex who actually owns Contribex and release.
By the way, anybody involved in Contribex, feel free to speak up about, no, I don't think so.
This is Paris. We've done a lot of this work already within the last couple of months and can piecemeal a lot of this together as far as like the identifications of the community resources that we have, who owns them, why, and things like that. And I think that's why we're currently at this state of what's in scope and what's out of scope for us, contributor experience, and what is community management. And so I feel like from steering committee perspective, it would be good to kind of help us get some of that stuff either in or out of our scope. And I guess just like find homes for it. And, just going back to Slack, like just because it's like the elephant in the room, it's just like who owns this exactly. So I guess that's what I take from it as far as like a community management is concerned. But like, for instance, like identifying what the community has, like what Jason's calling out in the issue, we definitely already have, and it's a mega Excel document that I can share with everybody. And that Excel document is going to get turned into a mega communications.md file.
Why don't I leave it open for this milestone then, and we can maybe touch base next time to see if there's any ambiguity to the document of what lands where. We can actually try to address those items. Does that seem like a fair approach here?
Yeah, 100%.
What about the code of conduct? If you don't mind, I saw it was on the thing, the code of conduct documentation. I think Michelle and I reviewed a charter some weeks back. I don't remember if there's been follow-up. Does anyone else have any state on this? Okay.
I know that Michelle was working on it. I think she's still, she's not actually listed there, but the other people on the Code of Conduct Committee actually are. We could probably leave it open for this milestone and then maybe touch base again on the next meeting because Michelle's not here, unless Paris has an update.
I think the onus is on us at this point, us being the Code of Conduct Committee, to update charter and things like that. I think from a documentation standpoint, a lot of that stuff is getting worked through, and I think the only, like the sort of blocker that we have right now is the charter, which will help us get unblocked in some other areas that will take care of this issue. So I feel like for the sake of this meeting, y'all can keep going.
Okay. there's the member standings issue, which also relates to the election process. And I'll put Brian here on this one as well, and I'll cross-link.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks.
Yeah, that was the issue that I saw that wasn't captured on that meta issue list. I think that means that we're pretty much whole with the election issues at this point.
I will also boot this out of this cycle. I think this is the one I was actually referring to originally, Brian, which is the staffing problem we currently have.
All right. Yeah, the difference between technical resources and people resources.
Yes. We have some documentation, but I don't necessarily know if it works, or if people are following it, or if it's well understood. Is there any action items that we think we should take here? Or are there any action items we should take here?
I think evangelizing best practices with respect to role definition.
Is there anyone who wants to help with this effort to try and try and address the issues that have been longstanding here? So
Paris commented in the chat that Contribex and networking are active. I attended a recent Contribex meeting where they discussed roles, and Contribex, I believe, is coming to SIG Architecture to talk about mentoring. And I've been looking at the SIG cluster lifecycle practices. I think if we can distill a few best practices and examples, then we can present it in the community meeting and try to evangelize it a little bit more.
Okay. How about I just leave this one open for the time being, and we can follow up, and I'll try to put some notes in here too about what we discussed.
Okay, thanks.
Quick time check. We have 3 more minutes.
We could go through one more issue, or are there any other last topics that we wanted to discuss?
I'm good with an issue.
Right.
Thanks for hurting the cats, Tim.
No problem. Find homes for unknown areas of the project. This is one of those things that fell into the languishing category for a long time. I don't necessarily know if it needs to be addressed in the near term, or if we just want to find somebody who wants to start to tackle these problems.
I think some of them have been addressed. Some of them have found homes. So someone maybe could go up and update to see which things are still remain. Yeah, like Paris commented, the GitHub admin issue is owned. We have GitHub admins under Contribex now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're nearing critical mass, and I can take this one off the milestone for update. That leaves us currently with 9 issues for this current milestone, and we have assignees for the entire litany of issues. Does it seem like this is while we have like 1 minute left, does it seem like this is a reasonable way to approach sort of breaking down the backlog and rallying folks here?
I think it was helpful.
Definitely helpful.
Just to give folks a meta point, this is typically how we roll SIG cluster lifecycle. We break it down, we have a milestone, we break down the issues, we prioritize them, we groom them, and we constantly iterate on them. And by doing this process, we kind of constantly get an update and traction and roll. Cool.
Thanks, Tim.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Paris suggests recording a video.
always, always record videos. I'm out. See y'all.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.